Hey, everybody. Today, we are going behind the poetry. I wish I had like a physical something for that. I'm like, it feels like it's behind the veil, it's behind a stage curtain. I don't know. But we are going to there, behind the poetry. For today's poem, we are talking about For Margaret. The cool thing about this recording that you're about to hear is that you are hearing my younger voice around the time that I was actually writing this piece. So this is a recording of For Margaret from my album Live at Java Monkey that was released in 2006. Check it out.
Everything I needed to know about being a woman, I learned from Judy Blume and Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I was 12 years old when I met Margaret. Me with the tortoiseshell glasses and pink sponge roller bangs, and she was just like me. Well, okay, she was Jewish. So she was quite a bit lighter, and her hair was quite a bit straighter, but we both felt alone in the world, trying to figure out what breasts and hips would make us become. And speaking of breasts, I really wanted some. I wanted to fill a training bra to capacity. Not that jockey sports bra that my mom got for me, but Margaret, she encouraged me that enough reps of we must increase our bust could fulfill my C-cup fantasies. And well, we see what happened with that. So while Margaret prayed to God to make her a woman, I played MASH. Ended up living in a shack with Tevin Campbell while we try to raise our 4 kids on a beekeeper's salary just so we can keep up the payments on our new Ferrari. I was a pretty girl disguised as a nerd who never quite made it to being a hottie, and I'm still looking for Ken, hoping I'll look just like Barbie. Forgive me for being a grown woman with the same fears I had at 13, because I don't want all the boys in my class to be shorter than me. Peering behind my glasses, hopefully wishing Adonis in the back of my pre-algebra class would notice me. If I could lose insecurities the way some people lose pounds, then I hope I'm the next Star Jones. But it's never that easy. Digging the skin you're in, it takes work. It takes wading through hurt, digging through dirt, reminding yourself how much you're worth. And Tyrus only got so many photos in her hand. And I may never be America's next top model, but all I'm really trying to be is my own best me. And that was the one thing that Margaret couldn't teach me. See, I had to learn to smile without my hand over my mouth like Celie. Learn to embrace my blemishes as beauty. And if I have to learn the lesson of loving imperfection for the rest of my life, then let that be my journey. Because there's this teenage girl who needs me to tell her that one day she's going to shed that old insecurity, break out of her cocoon and fly.
Oh, okay. We have so much to talk about regarding this poem. So what made me write this poem is my sister. I have a younger sister named Kita. I actually am the oldest of 5 siblings, but my sister Kita and I were actually raised in the house together. My other 3 siblings, we were not all raised in the same house. I have a sister in California and I have 2 brothers in Nebraska, but my sister Kita and I grew up in the same house, but we are almost 11 years apart. So around the time that I was writing this poem, my sister was probably, maybe she was 14 or 15 around the time of some of the conversations we had that really led me to write this piece. And my sister is, how can I describe her, y'all? Okay, I guess if I place the 2 of us next to each other, I'm, classic oldest kid, very play it safe. Took me a lot of years and maturity and therapy to get to where I would really say a lot of what I actually feel and think. And my sister is the opposite of me in that part. If she has it on her mind to say, like, she will say it. Not in a way that she just wants to be mean to you, but if there needs to be some direct communication, like, she will tell it to you. Like, if we're at the mall shopping and I pick up a shirt and she thinks it's ugly, she will say it's ugly. If she were to pick out a shirt, which this would never happen because she's super fashionable, but if she were to pick out a shirt that I thought was ugly, I would find 17 different ways to sort of get around there and try to communicate to her that, you know? So even as a teenager, my sister was very direct with me and sharing with me what it was like for her in her school. And this was around the age where she was starting to have crushes and starting to even notice not even just, you know, her own feelings or attractions, but also, you know, sort of having that outside look on how that was going for other kids in school or other kids she was friends with. And there were a lot of things that we talked about as far as, you know, what it meant to have a crush on someone and what it meant to be a girl and all those different things. And as she's sharing that with me in her early teenage years, I'm almost 11 years older than her, but actually not feeling like our experiences are that different. You know, like I'm listening to her going like, yeah, I feel like that at work, or I feel like that when I go to an event and I have to be around people that I find attractive, you know? And so I think it brought up for me this idea that there's a lot of the girlhood and womanhood experiences that are very circular, right? That they're not linear experiences, that there are things that you experience at 15 that you may experience in a very similar way when you're 38, you know, or when you're 27 or whatever that is. And so I thought that idea was really interesting and I wanted to really think about that. So that was a part of what inspired me to write this poem. And I think the other thing, which is why Tyra Banks and America's Next Top Model are getting a nod in the middle of this poem, is because also around the time that my sister and I are having all these conversations, and she's being very blunt with me about how things are at school, what it's like being a teenager, right? I had an opportunity to audition for America's Next Top Model. At that time, the cutoff age for America's Next Top Model was 27. And I was 26, getting ready to turn 27, probably in 3 or 4 months after this audition, if I'm remembering right. And a friend of mine knew someone that was working in casting when America's Next Top Model came to Atlanta. And so he said, hey, I know somebody who's casting. They're looking for girls who are tall and beautiful. Like, would you be into it? And if so, I can connect the two of you. So he did. And this was a season of my life where, you know, it was around this age between 25 and 27 that I really started feeling this hankering that I needed to get married, you know, and not because there was someone to marry at that time, because there wasn't, but it just started to feel like, you know, when I was in high school, I always thought I would have been married by the time I was 23 or something. I don't know why I thought those things, but I did. Well, that's not true. I probably thought those things because I was in love with a boy in high school and we were falling in love when we were probably 14 or 15. And so, you know, I knew my mom wouldn't be with it if I were to get married out of high school. So I think my plan was like, you know, we can stay together, you know, all this massive amount of years, you know, we'll stay together through high school and college, and then we'll get engaged when it's graduation time. And then after I've been out of college a year, we'll get married. And of course, none of that worked out that way at all, right? But I think by the time I was reaching that sort of 25, 26, approaching 27, I was starting to feel this just itch really about the fact that I didn't seem close to marriage and that I felt like I just kept like looking at my body and thinking about myself and just thinking like, this is amazing. I mean, somebody should come along and be a part of this, you know? And knowing that there wasn't much I could do about getting married, I think the other thought that was coming to my mind was, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to get married, but I need to think about what are the other things, you know, I dream to do. And because I've always been, for most of my life, I've been tall almost all of my life. And for a long time, I was just tall, rail thin, not a lot of curves. And whenever you have a body type like that, a lot of times people associate that with one of two things. Either they think that you're going to be a basketball player, or they want to know, have you ever considered modeling? And I always laugh because First of all, I was not a great athlete, so the whole basketball thing wasn't going to work out because I just don't like to sweat. And at that time, I liked to keep my nails real long. So I was like, none of that's going to work out for basketball, you know? And with modeling, it really took me until I was right there in my mid 20s before I realized that I was cute. So when I get this invitation to at least attend this casting, I'm like, yeah, I got to figure this out because I just need to see, could I have had any kind of future being a model? And so the woman who was working on the casting, there were actually two separate castings for the show at that time. One of the castings was just like the general, you know, everybody that like lines up outside and spends the night so they can be the first person in line. Kind of if you watch shows like American Idol and you see sort of that kind of like mania around it, like that was one casting. And then there was something I didn't know existed at the time, which was a pre-casting. And the pre-casting meant that the people who were casting the show picked girls and women that they felt fit sort of the motif of model, right? So I was in a room with about 60 other girls ranging from 19 all the way up to 27. And we were all 5'8" and above, and most model-esque bodies. I would say they were probably 4 or 5. When I say model-esque, I mean not what should really be considered model-esque, right? And of course, thinking about this now, this was almost 15 years ago. Let's take that in. So at that time, in this part of the industry, to be considered model-esque meant that you were like a size 0, you were a size 2, right? So of 60 of us, I would guesstimate that there were only 5 to 7 people who were not a size 0 or a size 2. So I'm air quotes when I say model-esque, right? Because we know that everybody or any body should be able to be model-esque or be a model, right? So anyway, I'm there in the room and it's just a weird mix of feelings being in a room like that, you know? I think a part of it brings out some insecurities because, you know, you're in a room with all of these women who are gorgeous and tall and beautiful, you know? So I definitely felt like, oh gosh, you know, I don't know how I fare against the other women here. At that time, I was probably a size 6. So at a size 6, just so you all have an idea of what was going on in the room, at a size 6, I was in those 5 to 7 of us that really didn't quite fit the sizing of air quotes model-esque, right? So I just remembered that experience also and how that was another moment, you know, that I thought about some of the things my sister and I were talking about that she was experiencing as a teenage girl, those insecure feelings you have in your body as your body is going through all this and what it means to love yourself, accept yourself. And here I am, a grown woman, you know, 10 years older than her, and I'm standing there in this room feeling all the same insecurities that I felt walking around the halls of my high school. And so I definitely think that experience of the audition played a role in this piece getting written. To give you the end of the America's Next Top Model story, did I make it on the show? No. Did I make it past even the group of 60 to where you actually get to meet Tyra or meet the judges of the show? No. But I did the audition. I didn't make it any further past that round because they were taking us through quite a few rounds. So I think maybe I made it past one more round of cuts. And then that second round of cuts, I think I was cut with another group of girls. So do I regret that I didn't make the show? Not necessarily. I think for me, it was more so about just having tried it and having attended the casting and not talked myself out of it. And that's not something that I ever have to look back on and have these regrets that I didn't do it, you know? And when I was performing on stage, I would always tell this story that, you know, I've always imagined myself having a daughter because I came from a family full of women, you know? So it was always like my grandmother, my mother, me, my sister, right? And so I always imagined, you know, if I have a daughter, man, like I don't want to be the mother that's like, braiding my little girl's hair at night. And I'm like, your mama could have been somebody, like I didn't want to be that mom. I wanted to be able to say to my daughter, for some reason in my mind at that point in my life, to my daughter in particular, I wanted to be able to say, here are the things that mommy did, when mommy was a young woman. These are the things that I experienced or accomplished, things I got to do that were really fun, And then I met your dad. And these are the things your dad and I went and we did and we accomplished and we experienced and we had fun. And then we had you. That was more of like the narrative I wanted. And so I felt like even though the audition didn't go anywhere, it was a win for me because it was something that I tried. And I had this phrase I would say to myself at that season of my life. I would say, I don't want to leave any of my dreams unturned. And so there was my little model dream. And so I tried it. And I was like, okay, I got that out of my system. I can say I did it. If I don't make it, it's not because I didn't put my hat in the ring for it, right? So in this poem, I am taking you back to 12-year-old me that is reading a very quintessential book, Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And I have been wearing glasses since I was 8 years old. And in particular, in this era of time, when I was like a preteen going into my early teens, it was the early 90s. So my mom claims that these big glasses were the style then. And I don't know, the jury is still in deliberation regarding if this is a truth. But either way, I had glasses that were just taking up most of my face. This was before I got responsible enough to wear contacts. And even when I did get old enough as a teenager, this was before there were like really the types of disposable lenses you have today where you can wear them for 2 weeks or whatever and throw them out. Like you would get that one pair a year, just like you got the one pair of glasses. And then if you lost one down the drain, bless your heart, So this is 12-year-old me reading Judy Blume's book. And what's interesting to me now is trying to describe to someone much younger than me that at this time of life, when, you're going through puberty and like you're in the body I was in, I'm experiencing like, the hairs under the armpits and the breast either growing or not growing, right? Like all this stuff that was going on in the body. Well, there wasn't any Google to go to and be like, how big do my breasts have to be before I can wear a training bra? Or, when will I know if my period's starting? Or why do my underarms stink? Like there was no website at that time to go to and search these things. And so Judy Blume's book for a couple of generations of us really was the place where you went. You went to her book to be like, okay, she's going to tell us. And if you're not familiar with this book, the central character in this book is around this preteen age, Margaret. And it's actually a very fascinating book because Margaret is going through puberty and those changes as a character, but she's also on this like religious journey because one of her parents is Christian and one of her parents is Jewish, and she's trying to figure that out. So it's actually reread the book as an adult, and I was like, yo, this is like even deeper than I remember. And honestly, when I was a kid, I don't know that we were reading through the book itself. We were sort of like sneaking into the library and a couple of us in a corner, really going to the pages where she was talking about the things we wanted to know about, which is what was going to happen to our bodies, right? Also, Judy Blume's character here, Margaret, that she created for this book, really was talking about a thing that I really wanted to know about. I was fascinated with getting breasts. And of course, because I was fascinated with it, I did not have any breasts. They did not come to me until much later in my life. But I really wanted to have some breasts. And I actually was praying and asking God to give me a C cup because I felt that was like an average ask. I'm like a classic oldest kid. I'm not asking for too much. I'm trying to find like a middle ground of things to ask for. And so the C cup felt like a thing. Now, my grandmother is very well endowed in the chest area, okay, and has been since she was like a preteen. So she always told us girls in the family that she basically prayed that no one in the family would have breasts the size of hers. So when I heard her say that, I felt some type of way because I was like, I feel like her prayers is kind of like canceling out my prayers. And I feel like if God gonna choose between us, like he gonna choose my grandma just based on seniority, just based on like, she's been with the company longer, So all this conversation around breast was like really fascinating to me. And now I laugh when I read the original wording of this poem because I really never made it to a C cup at the time of this writing. I was like in a B cup. But then let me tell you something. I don't know if this happens to everybody. I think in some ways it might, but the body parts may be different. But when I turned 30, it was like I experienced this like hormonal change that I really felt like was like a secondary element of puberty. And my breasts got bigger in my early 30s. I remember when I was getting married to my now husband, but he was then my fiance, right? And I went to Victoria's Secret to get measured for my lingerie before my bridal shower. And I remember the woman measuring me, like calling out what my cup size was. And I was like, no, it's not. And she was like, it is. Like she was trying to show me like on the tape, it is. This is the band. This is your cup size. And I was like, it's not. And I walked out mad, went over to Macy's, made them measure me all over again. And the woman was like, that's you. The woman in Macy's was like, yeah, what she told you, that's you. This is all you now. So I went from being a B cup for a very long time to arriving into the D's in my 30s, y'all. And I don't know if it's like my prayers just got answered really late. I don't know. I don't know, y'all, but it's wild every time I say this poem because when I first was performing this piece and I would get to this line where I would do the, we must increase our bust. And then I would say, so I could fill my C cup fantasies. And then there's like a pause. Well, we see what happened with that. After a while, the longer I've done this poem, the less of a laugh that line would get because people would be looking at my chest like, I don't know, I think your prayers got answered. So in later versions of this piece, you will hear that the C cup isn't there anymore. I normally just say big chest because I'm not going to keep upgrading the letters in case my breasts decide to keep getting larger. I'm just telling you. This next section of this poem where I get into MASH is one of my favorite things. You don't hear this in the original recording, but the iteration of how this poem has changed since I've started doing it on stage over the years is if I'm at an event that's all women, sometimes I step out there and I open my set with this piece. No story, no introduction. I just start with it. And when I get right there, while Margaret prayed to God to make her a woman, I played MASH. I stop right there. And I always say, what does MASH stand for? And I call out the letters MASH, right? Mansion, apartment, shack, house. And I mean, when you're at an event and you can hear the women in there like saying the words with you, and I'm like, okay, and let's review. MASH was a game that had these different categories and you played on notebook paper, right? And you had like a category for like who you wanted to marry and how many kids you wanted to have and what you wanted to be when you grew up and the kind of car you wanted to drive. And then you did this like circle squiggly thing until your friend said stop. And then you counted the lines and the squiggly thing. And then you did process of elimination. That was supposed to like, predict your future, right? And as I go through that memory, being in a crowd of women, being like in an arena or in like a big ballroom or whatever venue I was in, like being in that space and hearing the energy of other women that also did this growing up was everything. That to me was also a way of evening the listening field, if you will, for the audience, because a lot of the women's events that I would do, they were multi-generational. And so there would sometimes be grandmothers there as well as their great granddaughters who were teenagers, So getting to explain MASH, because there were some people in there who were like, I don't know what this is. I never played this growing up type thing. But there were also women in there that were even older than me that remembered reading this book initially when it had come out. So this is one of my most fun things. And I love when I'm writing pieces to throw Easter eggs in there. And even this Tevin Campbell mention to me was an Easter egg because I'll tell you, I love especially putting Easter eggs in poems for Black girls. And I can't tell you that I always do it intentionally, that when I'm writing, I'm like, I'll put this. I'm just writing from what my experience was because I really did have a crush on Tevin Campbell. He totally would have been in my MASH game. And the way MASH got played, you could end up living in a shack with Tevin Campbell, trying to raise 4 kids on a beekeeper's salary and with a new Ferrari. That's like a thing that could happen on your MASH thing. But I love saying the name Tevin Campbell and knowing how many young Black girls were like me and are now grown women and are at some of these events and are like, oh, Tevin, yes, so I love doing those things. And I think when you get into the meat of this piece, when I hit this moment, forgive me for being a grown woman with the same fears I had at 13. That's part of what I feel like I was learning from those conversations with my sister and thinking about all the insecure moments that made me feel, I don't know, like I wasn't beautiful. Made me feel that way when I was a teenager, and that those moments are still there. And we have lots of reasons as girls and women that we don't feel beautiful or that we don't value who we are or how we are. And so I loved digging into this piece right here, the nod to talking about Tyra there and just talking about how this is really about you knowing how much you're worth. I loved dropping the Easter egg of the character of Celie from Alice Walker's The Color Purple there. That's another fun one for me, that whenever I'm in a crowd and I know Black women are there, that when I get to that, I had to learn to smile without my hand over my mouth like Celie, that I know that phrasing is going to mean the world to them like it does to me, right? So I think this poem closing with hearkening back to this teenage girl, who really in certain ways to me is inside each of us. As women, there is the teenage version of us that is still there. But also one of the things that I had started to say whenever I would do this poem in front of an audience of teenage girls, because I'll have to do another episode about it, but there was a time in my career that I actually talked. Maybe I have to do a That Time I about this, but there was a time in my career, it was short-lived, but there was a time that I did talks for teenage girls in church settings, and we would talk about sex. A lot of it was about talking about abstinence and celibacy. I'm gonna be honest with y'all. And it got uncomfortable for me because I didn't feel like it was giving the young women the best information that they could have. And so I stopped doing that. Towards the end, I just started realizing there are so many other important things to talk to girls about besides talking to them about abstinence, that we needed to talk about consent. And we needed to talk about ownership of your own body and boundaries and what it means to honor the body you have. And we needed to also not walk into a setting like that in church where you're talking to teenage girls and assume that all of the girls there are straight. And so those are reasons why I stopped being the person that did that talk, because I realized there'd be a lot of church settings that wouldn't welcome what I really wanted that talk to be about. And I really wanted it to focus less on all the things that girls shouldn't be doing and more on what you should do to love yourself and what you should do to honor your body and to make wise sexual choices. And that is a lesson for teenage girls, and it's a lesson for grown women too, So anyways, that's for a whole other time. But whenever I would do this piece and I was in front of an audience of teen girls, I would always say to them something that I really do believe is true. And I would say to them, I know that it's hard, being in high school, going through your teenage years. It's not an easy time. But I would say to them, almost every feeling that you feel, grown women, like the grown women in here, because I would typically be in a space where there would be a lot of teenage girls attending like a conference or something, but there would be moms or different like chaperones or youth leaders in the room too. And I would say almost every feeling you feel as a teenage girl, there are grown women who are adults and they feel those similar feelings to you, that womanhood is not a linear journey. It's actually a very circular experience. And that is something beautiful about it, that it's a thing we get a chance to go through together, and hoping that, even though I know some of them were super weirded out, to think that their moms want to make out or that their moms ever made out or ever had sex or anything. It's weird. I know that's weird for teenage girls to think about, but I just wanted them to feel like womanhood doesn't have to be a lonely thing, that womanhood is a communal experience too. So what was it like performing this poem for the first time? I'm almost certain that one of the first times I performed this poem memorized was actually at a slam. And I know you're probably going to hear me say that 1,000 times in these Behind the Poetry episodes, but a lot of my show pieces, a lot of the pieces I do that make it into my poetry set, many of them started from me not necessarily even writing to slam, but because I was doing slam poetry at the time. And if you're listening and you're not familiar with slam poetry it's the competitive side of spoken word. It's the Olympics of spoken word poetry, if you will. And so it can go from local competitions all the way to national and international competitions. And so I was writing a lot at the time, but I was also writing because I did want to win some slams, and I was understanding more what the form of a slam poem was. And you had to really punch with a message and bring it home in less than 3 minutes. And so I'm pretty sure the first time I ever did this poem was at a slam competition. And this poem did really well in slams because it has so many dynamics to it. I also want to say that this was the first funny poem that I ever wrote. And slam is interesting because when you're in a competition, it's very organized as far as, if you're in a bout, which is what this one small component of the competition would be called. Your bout would be you and maybe 3 other slam teams if you were doing a team slam. And so there would be all this numerical things that went on as to the order in which each team competed. And sometimes, your team might send up a group piece, but sometimes you might have a dope enough poem that they'd send you up to do your poem by yourself. And I noticed when I would do slam competitions locally that a lot of times, a lot of the poems were heavy, because a heavy poem could win a slam if it was well written and well performed and really hit home to the judges, But you almost needed funny poems as a palate cleanser in a way. And there were times that a funny poem would score even better going after a poem that was really heavy, because the audience just enjoyed having that sort of relief of being able to laugh. And so I didn't intend this poem to be funny. I really just was approaching it to write the story. But in slam, I discovered the poem had a lot of power because it did have this comedic element. It opened people up to laugh and to reminisce. And then by the time you really get to the point of well, what is all this about? Why are we talking about training bras and Judy Blume and Tyra Banks? Why are we talking about all that? When you get to that end of sort of if the poem is its own cyclone, and it starts off with the wider part at the top and then goes down, down, down into the bottom as the tube of it gets smaller and smaller. I think that then you're getting into the meat of what the piece is about, and that it's not just about training bras. It's actually about saying whoever you are and whatever your insecurities are, you can spread your wings and fly, whatever that looks like to you. You can embrace the imperfections of your own beauty. That's the center of the piece. But it was fun that I got to talk about training bras and breasts and MASH and all these things leading up to that. I will say one of my favorite ways I've ever performed this poem is when I did compete nationally for one of Atlanta's slam teams. Another poet and I, and her name is Gypsy O. Shout out to Gypsy O if you're listening. Another poet and I did this poem as a duet. So it was still with the same writing that I'd written, but instead of it just being me, she and I performed it together, and we had this choreography where our arms linked. And I hate to this day that I cannot find the footage of us having done that piece together. So that was what it was like performing this piece for the first few times. And after I got done with slam, and when I began to learn how to build poetry sets, right? And poetry sets are where it's not just the poet coming up and doing one poem at a time, but it's where the poet can do sort of like how a comedian can do like a 10-minute set, could do a 30-minute set, could do an hour set or 90-minute set. And so when I started learning how to build sets, at that time, I was still performing at a lot of women's events. And when I figured out how to build a poetry set with the stories and the poems to go together, that's when I really knew the power of this piece, that I could walk out on stage and open with it. I could put it in the middle of a set and tell my America's Next Top Model story. And I could stop in the middle of the poem and talk about MASH. I could tell these stories about my grandma, like sort of praying against my own prayers about my breasts. You know, there was all this other stuff to do with it on stage. And I think that's interesting because when I started out my professional career as a poet, you know, many of you have been listening to this, or if you're familiar with my work, you know this part already. But if you're new here, when I started out professionally, I started out in Christian spaces, in very conservative Christian spaces, white evangelical spaces. And so at that time, the only place where spoken word poetry could go was in these very prescribed moments, you know, like it had to go between this song and that song, or it had to go inside this song in this certain kind of music. And so I performed like that for a long time. And then, you know, when I started kind of going through some changes with church and different things, I returned back to the poetry scene and then went into slam. Well, in slam, you're on a time crunch, so you can't walk up and like introduce your piece because as soon as you start talking, the timer is going. So you got to hurry up and say whatever you're going to say. And when I finally got into building my own sets, that was the first time I could really take my time and say a poem and figure out not just how you perform the piece itself, but how you tell the story that leads into the poem and how you tell the story that leads out of that poem into the next thing. And that I really feel is where my strong suit is as a performer, but it's also where the fun and the passion is for me. That's the part I love, not just, you know, this moment with the haze machine, you know, and the guitar and you there, do your poem. Like my favorite thing is when I get that 30 minutes or I get that hour. Then I just feel like the audience and I have time, you know, to breathe and get to know each other. And I can tell some stories. I can do a poem I didn't plan to do. And this poem, Margaret, is a pretty strong fixture in my poetry sets, and especially when I'm performing for an audience of women. Now, okay, here is a very interesting follow-up story because normally I close these episodes by telling you all how I feel about the poem now. So let me tell you a wild thing that happened in 2020, right before the pandemic tipped. So right before the pandemic tipped, my January through middle of March 2020 was wild times. It was so busy. I had a lot of events on my plate. And I was then, and I still am right now, working with Pattern Beauty, Tracy Ellis Ross's natural hair care brand. So I'm the poetic partner for Pattern Beauty. So I flew into LA in February, in part to be with my folks from the Together Live tour. If you've been listening to this for a while to my podcast, you probably heard me talk about Together Live. And so Together Live had happened in the fall. And then Together Live was invited to open up Makers, which is a global summit for women. And I was very excited to be invited to Makers. And a small crew of us from Together Live were opening the Makers event with sort of like a micro version, right, of what the tour was like. And I realized that Judy Blume was scheduled to appear at Makers. And it's wild to think of, y'all, because Judy Blume, as far as I know, I think at that time she was in her late 70s, but I think she's turned 80 now. So when I think about this, I'm like, you know, I had an opportunity to see her in person, but I only had one poem that I could do on stage. But I knew that Judy Blume was going to be at the event, but I couldn't see from stage if she was actually sitting there in the audience. So instead of doing Margaret, I performed my piece for the women, which is another one of my favorite poems to do. And I left, I guess after we all like finished our time on stage, I somehow found out that Judy Blume had been sitting there in the audience the whole time. And y'all, I went back to my hotel room, and I'm just going to tell y'all something else. Getting booked to speak at an event like Makers was just a big honor for me, and getting to be with our crew from Together Live was also dope. I'm going to tell y'all one thing I missed in the pandemic, because I have not traveled like that since March, is a really nice hotel. And we were staying at a very, very nice hotel, like big old tub, big old shower, big old bed. And then you had like a little living area out in the front. You could just see the whole skyline of LA out there. I mean, it was a very, very nice room. So I was pitifully soaking myself in this amazing 5-star tub. Just all of the terrible feelings washing over me that I missed my opportunity to perform Margaret for freaking Judy Blume herself. Are you serious? And I'm just like, man, Amena, you did, I'm trying to get myself to talk. You did the best you could with what you knew. You didn't know she was going to be, all the things. So I get dressed to go back to Makers the next day. I don't have any more stage responsibilities, but I just want to go and like hang out and learn and hear everyone talk. And I walk into the green room, and Dylan, who is the leader of Makers, Dylan walks up to me and says, "Oh my gosh, why didn't you perform Margaret yesterday?" And I almost like cried in her arms, because I was like, I know, and I meant to, and then I didn't, and I can't. And she was like, "Did you even get to meet Judy Blume?" And I was like, "I didn't." She was like, "Come meet her right now." And let me tell you, any performing artist worth their salt. And I would particularly say for poets who are performers and for singers, this is especially true. You never know when you're going to be in a moment where somebody's going to be like, "Sing right now, do your poem right now." And sometimes people do that, and it's not worth a moment. It's not worth a moment of you doing that live, My grandmother's in the grocery store with a stranger, and she's like, "Do some poems, baby. Do some poems for her. I told her you do poems." Like that feels like, oh, grandma, come on, But every now and then you're going to have this moment where you're going to be called upon, and that's your time. I think there are a lot of singers that sort of have stories to tell where, that was Quincy Jones, or that was, whoever, insert record executive name here, And so there are times that you got to be like a poet worth your salt right there. And am I going to go over here and give Judy Blume this poem as if I did it on a stage for 50,000 people? Oh, absolutely, I'm going to do it. So Dylan takes me over. She's like, "I've got to run, but I'm just going to like introduce the two of you." So in the green room at Makers, behind, like there's like a partition, right? So like the first part where you walk in is where all the like food, drink stuff. But when you like go behind the partition, there are makeup artists and hair artists back there. So Judy Blume is getting her makeup done, y'all. And Dylan walks me over, introduces us, tells her like, "Amena has this poem. I thought she was going to do it yesterday. She didn't. And I really wanted to see if it would be okay if she could do it for you." So I'm like, oh. So Judy Blume is finishing up getting her makeup done. We're doing a little chit chat. And then she says, "Well, how long is the poem?" And I said, "Oh, it's less than 3 minutes." And she was like, "Oh, I can do that." So the makeup artist finished her makeup and turned her makeup chair to face me. And one of the other makeup artists filmed this while this is happening. And y'all, if I didn't get the opportunity for an audience of Judy Blume and the makeup artist and hair artist who were back there to say Margaret to Judy Blume, it's just one of those things that you're like, that's only going to happen to you maybe once, maybe twice in your life, that you write something inspired by someone else's work and you actually get to look them in the eyes and say it to them. So I performed the piece for her. She's laughing and gasping in all the places I hope someone laughs and gasps. She's teary, and so am I, because I can't believe I'm getting this opportunity. She hugs me. I could just cry telling y'all that I had that opportunity to hug Judy Blume, because even if I were to see her again, who knows how long it would be before I would be able to hug her, right? And just having this wonderful moment with her and getting to say in my own way to her, here is how much that book you wrote meant to me. So it turned out that was 2020 was 50 years since Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret was published. So that's my story about Margaret, y'all. It started with my sister inspiring me to write this poem. And the current amazing thing about this poem is that I got a chance to actually perform that for Judy Blume. Oh, what is life? I had so much fun talking to y'all about that. I hope y'all had fun too. If you are a person with breasts, I hope that you just enjoy whatever size that you have, okay? Whatever it is, I hope you enjoy it, take advantage of it, okay? You can also listen to Margaret and some of my other poems by checking out my album live at Java Monkey, wherever you stream music. And you'll probably go there and find Live at Java Monkey, and you'll discover that I have a bunch of other albums that I hardly ever talk about, but they are there too. So you are welcome to peruse those on your favorite streaming app. You should also check out Judy Blume's book, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. If you haven't, go to your favorite bookseller and do this and check out other works of Judy Blume's. She is amazing and such a pioneer for us in having brought some of these girl and woman conversations to the forefront in her book. We love to see it. And if you want to actually watch me perform Margaret for Judy Blume, you can actually check that out on my IGTV. The footage is posted there. For this week's Give Her a Crown, I want to shout out Dr. Maya Angelou. I was trying to think about other writers that really influenced me during that same time that I was reading Judy Blume's Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And Maya Angelou came to my mind. And I hope you know this name because she has many, many crowns, I'm sure. But I am happy to bestow upon her one more. I remember starting my journey with Dr. Maya Angelou's work by reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which is written from the perspective of a young Black girl not too far in age from the age I was when I first started reading Judy Blume's work, when I first started really discovering what all of this was going to mean, becoming a young girl, transitioning into whatever young womanhood would look like. I never got to hear Dr. Angelou speak in person, but her words, her career, and her life left a serious mark on me, just the boom and timbre of her voice. Right? Any of you that have listened to her work probably feel the same way. I remember watching her perform her poem at President Bill Clinton's inauguration, how so many of us, a generation of us, were memorizing that poem and performing it at church or at speech competitions, and how amazing it was for me this year to be watching the inauguration of President Biden and watching poet Amanda Gorman, who is phenomenal. I actually originally got to meet Amanda on the Together Live tour in 2019, and she killed it. And it just made me think, watching her perform, that here she is continuing on Dr. Angelou's legacy while also building this amazing legacy for herself. How many young Black girls just like me will look at Amanda and know that they can be poets too? Dr. Angelou, many of us are writers and poets because of you. You aren't physically here with us, but you left your presence and your legacy. May we make you proud by being ourselves and taking up our space just as you taught us. Dr. Maya Angelou, give her a crown. Her with Amena Brown is produced by Matt Owen for Soul Graffiti Productions as a part of the Seneca Women Podcast Network in partnership with iHeartRadio. Thanks for listening, And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.